always still put people before herself.
Her favourite thing was always to spend time with her children.
Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you...
Navigating grief has been a long road for this Yamatji family.
She adored her nieces and nephews just like her own children. For us, black fellas, that's important. That's how we grew up.
No matter how she struggled with her mental health, she always had a smile. What happened to my daughter that day was preventable. It was preventable. There was red flags everywhere. It was preventable.
On the 10th of June 2022, Christelle walked into this Port Hedland hospital worried she would hurt herself. She was struggling with borderline personality disorder, a condition that severely impacts emotional regulation.
My sister was in a place that should have felt safe and kept her safe.
Christelle was taken to Cubicle 6, which has at least one hanging point, but was used for patients with mental health issues. The triage nurse was aware of her diagnosis and history of self-harm. The nurse wrote,
"Drank a large amount of wine, trying to forget and drown out her suicidal thoughts. No active plan today, knows that she needs to live for her kids. Teary."
Christelle was assessed as being at risk of self-harm, requiring visual observation every 10 minutes. Her sister Rochelle has seen CCTV footage of the next moments.
She goes and sits outside of the hospital near a pillar, and she's in a fetal position, really quite distressed, crying.
After talking to an assigned nurse, Christelle went back inside.
There was no offering of her to have family members contacted, her children to be contacted.
A report said the nurse felt she'd established a good rapport with Christelle and went to get her a cup of tea. When the nurse returned 21 minutes later, Christelle was unconscious.
My sister was left unattended for over 20 minutes, and that's where my sister's taken the action upon itself to take her own life.
Christelle died 10 days later.
I believe they were very complacent with my sister. There was times where Christelle would visit the hospital before and she felt judged because of her drinking and because of her being Aboriginal.
WA Country Health Service investigated Christelle's death and has made some improvements. It acknowledged that for Aboriginal patients, having family around is crucial in times of vulnerability. It's also promised to ask patients who present at EDs like this one alone if they'd like a loved one called.
The investigation found that the nurse was absent for longer than intended. In a statement, WA Health told 7:30 the hospital was appropriately staffed that day, demand was moderate and the one-on-one care provided to Christelle was compassionate. It said they remain committed to delivering culturally responsive health services to Aboriginal people.
But I now don't have a sister because someone decided to leave a room for 20 minutes and no one offered her the correct services at the time to help protect her.
How did they offer to help her?
A cup of tea and a sandwich.
They should have had a family member or an Aboriginal liaison officer there to support her.
Bardi woman Professor Pat Dudgeon has been working to prevent Indigenous suicide for decades.
For Christelle, I think that she would have been treated differently had she been non-Indigenous.
Professor Dudgeon says alcohol use can increase the risk of First Nations patients being dismissed.
I think that that's all that unconscious bias in action, and it can have terrible consequences.
She says mainstream services, like hospitals, need to be right for mob.
Cultural responsiveness in a hospital setting is to have some knowledge about Aboriginal history, culture, different values.
7 Indigenous people are twice as likely to die by suicide than other Australians.
Indigenous suicide is different, and we know that colonisation and that story influences Indigenous suicide rates, plus ongoing racism, direct and systemic, so that all, our current disadvantage.
A key Closing the Gap target is reducing suicide to 0, but this gap is getting worse.
Where I think we need changes, policy change and government rethinking, and that is sort of happening. I think while those changes are happening, we also need to invest in community-led solutions like programs and services. Also, we need to invest in ensuring that the mainstream services are culturally responsive.
Professor Dudgeon says Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations are key to preventing suicide.
All Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people should have mental health and wellbeing supports in their local communities. Self-determination is critical. So if people aren't having a say in what happens for them, it's going to be very ineffective.
So in 2020, all levels of government signed up to a new Closing the Gap agreement. It promised to share decision-making and power with Aboriginal-run organisations. But earlier this year, a scathing Productivity Commission report found governments were failing and unwilling to relinquish that control.
Going, sweetie. Hey, lovely to see you.
Good to see you.
So this is the Gelton Aboriginal Medical Service.
Graham's, in the town where Christelle was born and is buried, is an Aboriginal community-controlled organisation.
It's pretty heartbreaking. We lost a little one to suicide. He was only 10. There's some great work being done in our sector.
Graham's has a dedicated team working to prevent suicide.
Employ this whole team of 7 people that looked after all of them. So we are a part of that program. That went out into community, knocked on doors and asked, are you okay? Is there anything that Graham's can do for you? Everything has to be done holistically. You can't do one thing without the other.
The team offers free health checks, support with groceries, one-on-one counselling and workshops empowering mob to talk through trauma. And that's funding is ongoing for that team?
Well, we're a pilot program, so you know what happens when they say pilot. Sadly, you have a short lifespan.
This pilot is funded by the state government's Mental Health Commission until 2026. The WA Aboriginal Health Council says its future will be based on outcomes and available funding.
The bucket of money that we've got has gone from being, in some cases, generous to now very structured and very controlled and very tight.
The Productivity Commission report says organisations like Graham's should be partners, not passive funding recipients.
It is time to provide the appropriate resources to our mob to do this business. A dark cloud is over our mob.
In Port Hedland, Christelle's former partner Adrian and their children are holding each other close in their grief. But Christelle's spirit is never far.
The funny thing she would say is that the children are her medicine. And even my little daughter, she still comes up to me and says that. She goes, Dad, and gives me a hug and says, Dad, am I your medicine? And I'm like, yeah, of course you're my medicine, bud,
Closing the Indigenous suicide gap is more than policy and stats for this family. They say the next generation depends on it.
We need to address it, we really do. We just want change.
If you need help, you can call Lifeline on 13 11 14 or the helpline for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, 13 Yarn, on 13 92 76.